So guys, as you might have heard, after 5 years in early access, Squad version 1 has finally been released, and well, it turns out a lot of people are only just now discovering it. And look, I've made a few comparison videos on this game before, but that was actually quite a few years ago, and to be honest, it's completely different now. Most importantly though, since then, Squad has led a resurgence of the Project Reality style tactical shooter, paving the way for new franchises like, for example, Hell Let Loose. Or should I say that Hell Let Loose has evolved from that Squad formula? What do I mean by that? Well guys, this is BillyEatWorld again, and let's find out. Alright guys, how you going? Welcome to the video, and first up, if you're someone who hasn't heard of either of these games before, we probably should talk about what they've got in common. And well, like I said before, they're both based on a large-scale tactical shooter formula that really became popular back around 2005 with the Project Reality mod for Battlefield 2. And speaking of Battlefield, well, a good way to look at either of these games is that they're kind of similar but a lot bigger. They're both 50 versus 50, and the maps are absolutely gigantic. But apart from that, a lot of the features are pretty similar. There's class systems, vehicles, and most of the game modes are based around capturing sectors. That's really where the similarities end though, because the focus of Project Reality style games like Squad and Hell Let Loose is realism and immersion. Like for example, both games have realistic faction locked loadouts with very little customization, and the maps are designed using real life locations as a reference point as well. What that means is that both Hell Let Loose and Squad are more like military simulations than just games. Things aren't necessarily symmetrical, and that's how it's designed to be. But most importantly, they don't hold your hand like arcade shooters do, which is actually kind of refreshing, because then at least you know that you're in control of your own experience. Now, if you're someone who's played both of these games, I'm guessing you're probably already jumping to the comments to pull me up on some of the things that I just said. Because as much as these games have in common, they've probably got just as many differences. Basically, they're approaching the genre from different angles. To sum it up, in a nutshell, Squad is a game that pushes the realism factor to its limit, whereas Hell Let Loose kind of dials it back a bit more to make itself more accessible. Which means that even though both games do follow a same basic formula, at the end of the day, they're attracting a different kind of player. Just before we get into that though, we probably should talk about the main difference between these two games, which, if you haven't noticed by now, is obviously that Squad is a modern theme shooter and Hell Let Loose is a World War II shooter, which obviously might matter to you if you're someone that prefers one theme over the other, but to be honest, in this format, I really don't think it makes a huge difference to the gameplay. The reason historical shooters often feel different is because of a limited pool of weapons and a lack of weapon customization. But like I said, Squad doesn't really have that either. And look, there's probably a bunch of other thematic differences we could talk about in this video as well, but like I said, there's a lot of other stuff to talk about that affects the gameplay a lot more. The theme really isn't that much of a big deal, so we're not going to cover it that much in this video. So the question is then, what does make a difference? And well, probably the first thing you're going to notice is the difference in how these games look. And I mean, obviously both are indie shooters, but like I said before, Squad went into early access way back in 2015. And I think because of that, it's starting to look a bit dated by modern standards. With that being said though, there's definitely things that I do like about the graphics of both games. For example, I prefer the way that Squad handles lighting effects. But in general, when it comes to graphics, I think if you had to hand it to one or the other, just purely because it's almost 4 years younger, I think Hell Let Loose wins by a mile. More than just how the maps look though, I really think another important difference is how the maps have been designed. Because what you're going to notice when you jump into Squad is how massive the maps are, even compared to the fairly giant maps in Hell Let Loose. Not just that, but the maps in Hell Let Loose are generally flatter, narrower, and you can tell the devs have thought about the design of the maps and how that affects the flow of the gameplay. Whereas Squad's maps are more like realistic open world landscapes. You don't feel like you're being funneled down lanes, which is kind of weird if you're not used to that sort of thing. Now, moving on, that's a good segue into the next point, because another thing that you're going to realize is that the scale of the maps, combined with almost no HUD, makes navigating and finding enemies a lot harder. You won't see it in this video, I generally edit that sort of thing out, but I actually have to open my map quite a bit in this game to check where I am and where my squad mates are. And speaking of squad mates, well, in a game this big, obviously working and communicating as a team is going to be pretty important. And so not only do both of these games have squad and local VoIP, they also give you a ton of different ways to communicate with other players visually using the map. Now, this is actually a pretty important point of difference, because where squad limits visual communication almost exclusively to the map, Hell Let Loose doesn't. It allows you to ping where you think enemies might be, it allows squad leaders to place markers that can be seen in the 3D worlds, and it's even got a basic spotting system. And that's a huge deal if you're someone who either can't or doesn't want to communicate over VoIP. You can kind of get by with just the visual communication alone. And to be honest, in my opinion, you're probably missing out on a lot of the fun if you're not talking to other players. But once again, it's a concession that makes Hell Let Loose just that little bit more accessible for a wider range of players. Now, speaking of accessibility, well, we're only really scratching the surface so far, because ultimately it's the core mechanics that turn players on or off tactical shooters. And, well, first up, the main trade-off you're going to notice in Hell Let Loose is that the gunplay is a lot closer to arcadey shooters like Battlefield, for example. In the squad gameplay in this video, what you'll notice is that even though I'm using a lot of automatic weapons, I'm almost always using them in just semi-auto mode. And that's because recoil is pretty crazy in this game. Generally speaking, you only want to use fully auto if you're in really close quarters. On the other hand, though, it's actually pretty easy in Hell Let Loose to mag dump at people. It's not so much the recoil you have to deal with, but seeing through the muzzle flash with iron sights. But once you get past that, that makes a huge difference, because both of these games have a really fast time to kill, usually about 2 shots to kill and a guaranteed 1-hit kill headshot. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, if you can accurately burst fire at someone, you're going to have a higher chance of killing them before they can react to you, just purely because you've got a better chance of getting a headshot. And so what you'll notice is that it's actually relatively easy in Hell Let Loose to squad wipe 3 or 4 players in a single engagement, whereas in squad, not so much. Now, moving on, the last big point I want to make on the core mechanics is on the logistics system, which admittedly hasn't really been fully implemented in Hell Let Loose just yet. So if you are watching this someday in the future, maybe these two games will be a bit more similar then, but at the moment they kind of handle things like spawns pretty differently. For example, on the surface, they seem to have a few things in common. Squad leaders can place semi-permanent spawn points for the whole team or mobile spawn points for just their squad. But once again, squad is just that little bit more in depth. To build a team-wide spawn, for example, it requires a logistics truck brought up from the base, as well as a radio and a bunker that need to be assembled by your team. As a trade-off, though, that means that spawn points in squad tend to be more resilient, which means to force the enemy off an objective, you usually have to commit more forces. Whereas in Hell Let Loose, 1 or 2 players can easily flank around and take out the enemy spawn points, which obviously can completely turn the game around. Not just that though, but there's a lot more in the way of placeable fortifications in squad. So generally speaking, a lot of the action will tend to be focused around key strong points. Whereas with more spawns that get taken down sooner and with its smaller maps, Hell Let Loose tends to be a bit faster paced, somewhere in between, for example, the tempo of squad and something faster like, for example, Battlefield 5. Now, once again, when it comes to the differences in the core gameplay, we're really only scratching the surface here because it's pretty hard to cover everything in just one video. So if you do want to get a better idea of each of these games, I'd probably recommend you check out my specific reviews of Hell Let Loose and Squad, which I'll leave down in the description down below. There's a lot more info in there. But just to finish up though, I just want to make a couple of quick points on the growth of these games, because a few weeks ago, I probably would have said Hell Let Loose was on track to overtake Squad. But after the release of version 1.0, well, I'm not really that sure anymore, because the active player base has absolutely exploded in the last few days, which is insane considering, like I said, it's a 5-year-old game. Now, putting this current spike in numbers aside, Clearly both games have been growing through early access, but in saying that, Hell Let Loose has definitely grown faster in its first year and a half. And like I said, that's probably got a lot to do with the fact that it was born into a world where games like Squad already existed. And not just that, like I said, it's more accessible. And I think the most interesting thing is that looking at the Steam charts, it seems like maybe these two games aren't so much competing with each other, but helping each other out. For example, I think the fact that Hell Let Loose is just that little bit more accessible makes it a great gateway game for players coming over from, say, Battlefield 5 or Call of Duty. So to finish up, in a nutshell, I guess the main point I want to make in this video is that even with their differences, both Hell Let Loose and Squad seem to complement each other. And I think they're proving a couple of things about the genre and indie shooter games in general. They can grow over long periods of time and they don't need a live service to do it. So to finish up, in a nutshell, I guess the main point I want to make in this video is that even with their differences, both Hell Let Loose and Squad seem to complement each other. And I think they're proving a couple of things about the genre and indie shooter games in general. They can grow over long periods of time and they don't need live services to do it. To be honest, I actually thought Squad would be done and dusted before it even had a chance to be released. But here we are 5 years later and it's blowing up. And like I said, Hell Let Loose seems to be on an even faster growth trajectory, so maybe we'll be seeing something similar when it leaves early access as well. But what about for right now? Which one of these games should you buy? And I guess, well, if you can only really afford one, it depends on your playstyle. If you're coming over from, for example, COD or Battlefields, maybe you might want to check out Hell Let Loose first, or if you're coming over from, say, Arma 3, maybe just go straight for Squad. At the end of the day, though, both of these games offer a similar but unique style of gameplay and a level of replayability that you're just not going to see in almost anything else. And you can bet, as multiple AAA shooters come and go, Squad and Hell Let Loose will still be here to stay. And really, what more could you ask for in a game? But anyway, guys, that just about wraps up this quick review. So as always, please let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And just remember that I can't possibly cover every single detail about these games in the one video. So I'm going to leave some links to the specific reviews if you want to check them out down below. As always, though, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and please feel free to check out the links in the description if you want to see any more of these videos. And also, don't forget you can find my Twitter and Discord links down there as well if you want to keep in touch. And as always, until next time, see you later, and have a good one.